So, we're back again. We're going to be looking at a new topic this week, and for quite a few weeks now. We're going to be thinking about the question of art and its status versus craft and what connotations that has. So, let's recap. Last week we completed our lovely Guernica work, and we thought about answering the question, does an artist have to see something in real life in order to represent it? And produce practical work to explore that question. This week we're going to move on to this new idea of art versus craft, and we're going to do some written tasks and practical tasks again in order to explore it. So I'm going to skip ahead because I'm going to ask you some things in the session, ask you some things about an artwork, see what you think. After you've done that, we'll all have done it by now, looked at Todd Buncher, we're going to be thinking about what art versus craft means. So, step one in blue is to watch these two short videos, and they're by the artist Grayson Perry, and he's discussing what he thinks about art versus craft and what he thinks the differences are, and how they're represented maybe in the art world at the moment. After you've done that, I'd like you to think about these phrases that I've put on the screen in black and try and classify them into whether they're talking about or representing art, fine art, or whether they're representing craft. So if you pause the video now and quickly just write them down on a scrap of paper and try and separate them into the two categories, I'll go through in a minute what I think. So hopefully you've separated out your phrases. I've put mine into two categories, but hopefully what you'll have thought is that some of these maybe aren't set in stone. Maybe some of these could be considered art and craft. And so we're going to explore that now. Your task is in green. So I've highlighted 4 of the elements in green on the list, and I want you to think about how these cross the boundaries between art and craft. So you need to take each of these 4 aspects and explain what you think this is, what you think it means about art and craft. Why do you think it's relevant to both? Try to source your examples from established museums and galleries. So think about the Tate, V&A, Design Museum, etc. And you'll need to put your work onto a PowerPoint as usual. The good news is I've done an example on the next slide of how to approach it. Before I go through that though, I just want to talk about the 4 areas that I've highlighted and maybe give you a few starting points and ideas. So the first thing on art is that it's made to be looked at. There's this idea that it's art for art's sake, it's art to serve a purpose of being art. And I think that oftentimes we have objects that are art objects, but they could also be used practically. It's maybe about the artist's intentions and the concept, which is the second thing that I've highlighted. I think we always think that fine art has a concept, which it does, but that doesn't mean that some craft-made objects haven't got a purpose or something more than its function behind it. It can have a creative purpose in terms of the intention that the creative maker wants to put on it. Moving over to craft, the idea that craft objects aren't originals, that they're something that's mass produced, even if it's mass produced by somebody's hand, it means we've produced multiples of them. And the idea that an artwork is a one-off and that's why it's of value is very much stuck in the art world as a thing. But actually, when we think about it, it's not just craft objects like vases that we produce as multiples. Some fine art techniques are produced as multiples, and inherently so. So if we think about fine art printmaking, these are produced as a piece of art for art's sake, but they're produced as multiples. We can have editions of 5, 10, 500 prints. They're still a fine art object, but they are multiples. And then lastly, craft is serving a practical purpose. It's almost as a designed object, a product. I again think that there are loads of examples of art where it could be a practical object, but the artist has chosen to make it almost a 3-dimensional canvas rather than having a practical function, and the artist has put that meaning on it. It's not inherent in the object. And so I think that there's some of the ways that art and craft can be blurred. So this is an example that I worked through from Grayson Perry. Oopsie-daisies, sorry about that. So the phrase that I chose to look at first was art made to be looked at. And so I found this example of a pot by Grayson Perry called Aspects of Myself. And then I wrote about why I think that it is represented as an art object, but why it could blur the boundaries with craft. And so I thought about the idea of art for art's sake, the idea that an artist places the meaning on it. I said that his pots are actually entirely functional. They're watertight. He could put a flower in it, could be used as a vase to contain something. What would he think if somebody used it as a practical object? Would it take away some of the meaning if we just saw those things that he'd painted on it as decoration more than it being a canvas for his message? And so I've thought about what it can be as an art object, I've thought about what it could be as a craft piece, and I've thought about some of the questions that are still unanswered about it, and I don't have to answer them. Posing those questions shows that I understand the different viewpoints around the object. Sometimes we don't need to answer the question, so make sure that if there are things that you're not sure about, pose them as questions. It shows me that you're thinking about the object and trying to understand how it could be seen. So you need to work through all four of those. So we've got made to be looked at, based on a concept, produce multiples, and serve a practical purpose. You need to find an art object or a craft object for each of those to illustrate your point. Pop them all on a PowerPoint and then send me your work. So the title and assignments this week is Art versus Craft Crossover. So pop that on a slide, send it to me. Woohoo!